Hey guys, tonight we're pulling back the hood on medieval assassins. And spoiler, it's not all cloaks and cool theme music. Think cold stone, a rusted blade, and the smell of old piss. Before we dive in, hit like if you enjoy this kind of grimy history, and let me know in the comments, would you rather fight a dragon or a drunk peasant with a club? Dim the lights and get comfortable? No, really, because you wake up in a cramped garret, damp wool plastered to your skin, mice chewing the hem of your trousers, and a rope burn that aches like regret. You try to be silent, but every floorboard tattles, every alley reeks of smoked meat and sewage, and your stealth is basically hope plus careful breathing. Nope, not glamorous, no dental plan, no anesthesia, just blood, plague, and the constant risk of being stabbed by someone who hates your boots. Stick around, and I'll show you the tools that actually worked, the missions that went spectacularly wrong, and whether a medieval assassin ever had a real shot. So while I narrate, tell me, could you kill for rent? The cobblestones of 13th century Lyon glistened with a mixture of rain, horse sweat, and the occasional splash of stale ale, setting the stage for a lesson in misery. Armand, a lanky orphan with more hunger than hope, was led through the twisting alleys to a door stamped with a black dagger etched in soot. Inside, a dozen hooded figures whispered the Brotherhood's oath, while the scent of burning tallow and unwashed bodies assaulted his nostrils. The master, a grizzled veteran who looked like a medieval version of a cyberpunk hacker, thrust a rusted blade into Armand's palm and declared, "Welcome to the family business." The blade sang a thin, metallic note that sounded oddly like the opening riff of a heavy metal anthem. If you squint at history through a modern lens, training began at dawn, when the city's bells clanged like a giant alarm clock for the damned. Armand learned to stalk through the market's fish stalls, his boots squelching in the slime of spilled blood and brine, while a gaunt instructor barked commands louder than a town crier on a bad day. He practiced the silent slice, a technique that required the precision of a surgeon and the patience of a monk, all while the pungent odor of rotting cabbage wafted from a nearby vendor. Every missed strike earned a slap with a leather strap that smelled of sweat and old leather. Think of a medieval version of a gym trainer's motivational whack. By night, the apprentices whispered about the code: no witnesses, no mercy, and never, ever trust the guy who offers you a second helping of stew. Paranoia seeped into the Brotherhood like mold on a damp stone wall. One evening, a shadow slipped a poisoned dagger under Armand's pillow, a warning that betrayal was as common as rats in the sewers. The apprentices learned to check every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of the wind, as if the very stones might be listening. Armand's heart hammered louder than the town drummers during a festival, each beat echoing the dread that any brother could turn on him for a silver coin. The irony was palpable. A guild that taught loyalty through the language of knives was itself a house of backstabbers, a medieval version of Game of Thrones meets The Office. If The Office were a crypt, living quarters resembled a plague-infested barn more than a respectable hideout. The dormitory was a low-ceilinged cellar, its walls damp with seepage that dripped onto straw mattresses, already stained with the night's sweat. Rats made nightly raids, stealing crumbs, and occasionally the occasional finger, prompting Armand to develop a reflex that would make a cat jealous. Meals consisted of boiled gruel that tasted like the river after a rainstorm, punctuated by the occasional stolen morsel of smoked pork, a culinary delight comparable to finding a golden ticket in a dumpster. Yet, despite the filth and famine, the Brotherhood's camaraderie shone like a flickering torch. They shared jokes about the master's terrible haircut and swapped stories of botched contracts as if they were urban legends. When the induction finally ended, Armand emerged into the night, feeling both victorious and utterly exhausted, as if he'd just survived a marathon through a haunted video game level. He realized that being a medieval assassin was less about sleek, shadowy elegance and more about dodging rats, enduring bad food, and constantly questioning whether the person next to you was a friend or a future corpse. The city's lanterns flickered, casting long, wavering shadows that looked like the very daggers they worshipped. Armand cracked a wry grin, thinking that if he ever wrote a memoir, the subtitle would be "How Not to Die from Hunger While Trying to Kill Someone Else." And with that, he vanished into the alleys, ready to prove that, even in the darkest guild, a little humor could cut through the grime like a well-aimed blade. The parchment arrived soaked in the stench of rot, its seal a cracked ruby that belonged to Count Varick, a man whose reputation was as thin as the parchment itself. Armand read the contract under a flickering torch, the city outside coughing up plague-filled clouds that turned the cobblestones slick with gore-colored rain. The job: eliminate a rival merchant who dared to sell spices without paying the Duke's tax, basically medieval corporate sabotage. As he slipped the blade into his boot, a ragged child scurried past, coughing up blood that smelled like iron and fear. The irony wasn't lost on him. He was about to kill for a noble who probably never washed his hands after a banquet. First stop: the noble's manor, a gaudy stone cage where silk drapes fluttered like cheap carnival banners. Varick greeted Armand with a grin that could curdle milk, offering wines spiked with something that tasted like burnt leather and broken promises. Do it discreetly, the Count whispered. And remember, the city watch is as honest as a cat in a fish market. Armand laughed, because the only thing more corrupt than the Count's ledger was the smell of rotting fish wafting from the kitchen. He left with a sealed coin purse that jingled like a nervous mouse, knowing the payment could vanish faster than a plague victim's last breath. Next came the informant, a wiry street urchin named Pip, who claimed to know the merchant's hidden cellar. Pip led Armand through alleys that reeked of urine, spilled ale, and the occasional dead rat, his lantern sputtering like a nervous firefly. Halfway down a gutter, Pip vanished, leaving behind a crumpled note that read, "Wrong house, boss." The correct cellar turned out to be a wine cellar flooded with a sludge that smelled like fermented blood and cheap perfume. Armand cursed the universe, the city's poor sanitation, and his own habit of trusting anyone who could climb a fence in flip-flops. When Armand finally found the merchant, he was hunched over a ledger, his breath a sour cloud of pipe smoke and desperation. The blade sang, and the merchant's throat burst open, spraying crimson onto the stone like a bad Renaissance painting. Armand expected the promised gold, but the Count's messenger arrived with a sack of coins that felt lighter than a feather. Some were missing, some were counterfeit, and the rest were glued together with wax that smelled like melted cheese. Patronage is fickle, Armand muttered, recalling a line from an old troubadour's song about a knight who lost his horse to a rainstorm. He pocketed the few real coins, feeling the weight of betrayal settle in his gut like a stone. As he slipped back into the night, a sudden clash of steel erupted from the market square. Two rival gangs fighting over a shipment of silk, their swords clanging like a broken orchestra. Armand darted through the chaos, ducking splinters of wood and stray arrows that hissed past his ear, each one smelling of gunpowder and fear. A stray crossbow bolt whistled past, embedding itself in a nearby barrel and exploding in a spray of rotten vegetables that drenched his cloak. He realized the real danger wasn't the contract itself, but the city's habit of turning any bloodshed into a free-for-all. Standing on a rain-slick rooftop, Armand whispered, "Welcome to bleeding contracts," and wondered if the next job would at least pay him in something other than a cough and a cold. The night was supposed to be clean, like a freshly sharpened dagger glinting in moonlight. Armand slipped into the merchant's courtyard, heart thudding louder than a tavern drum, and raised his blade. A sudden clatter of a loose stone sent the target's guard scrambling, and Armand's own sword slipped, biting his own forearm instead of the noble's throat. Blood sprayed across his leather coat like a bad paint job, and the noble's scream echoed off the stone walls. alerting every night watch dog within a mile. Now limping through the alley, Armand realized that a botched hit feels less like a heroic movie moment and more like a medieval blooper reel. The city watch arrived with lanterns flickering like cheap fireworks, their boots splashing in the rain-soaked cobbles. Armand ducked behind a pile of refuse that reeked of fermented fish and broken dreams. Clutching his bleeding wrist, every shout from the watch sounded like a brass trumpet, announcing his impending doom. And the stench of horse, sweat mixed with the iron tang of his own blood. He slipped into a narrow passage where rats scurried like tiny, judgmental audience members, their beady eyes reflecting his own terror. By the time he emerged onto a bustling market, he was a walking advertisement for why assassins should have better health insurance. Just when he thought the watch was his worst nightmare, the Brotherhood's own enforcers appeared, cloaked in midnight black and smelling faintly of pine tar and disappointment. Their leader, a grizzled veteran named Vortigern, pointed a finger that could have been a sword and demanded Armand's surrender for breaking the sacred rule of no self-inflicted casualties. Armand tried to explain that the wound was an accident, but Vortigern's grin was as thin as a parchment scroll, and his dagger sang a low, menacing hum. A chase erupted through the slums, where the only soundtrack was the clatter of broken shutters and the occasional yelp of a stray dog that looked like a tiny, furry executioner. Armand realized that in this line of work, the only thing more lethal than a rival assassin is a brother who knows where you keep your secret stash of cheap wine. Back in his hideout, the throbbing wound pulsed in time with his guilty conscience, each beat a reminder that he had almost killed a man who probably just wanted a quiet dinner. He stared at the crimson stain spreading across the floorboards, feeling the guilt settle like a heavy cloak made of chainmail. Memories of past contracts, each a tidy little box of death, flashed like a Netflix binge of violent medieval dramas, except none had ever featured a protagonist who survived his own blunder. He tried to pray to the forgotten god of shadows, but the only response was the distant clank of a bucket being tipped over, as if the universe were laughing at his misfortune. The mental torment was a relentless siege engine, battering his mind with the question, if honor is a myth, why does the sword feel so heavy in his hand? In the end, Armand limped out into dawn, the city's first light painting the rooftops gold, and his own blood a dull rust color. He had escaped the watch and the Brotherhood, but the real victory was learning that medieval assassins get no applause, no medals, just a lingering ache that never quite fades. He laughed, a hollow sound that sounded like a broken lute string, and thought of the modern hero who gets a montage set to epic music after a botched mission. If only history had a director willing to cut the cringe and give him a proper ending, he might have felt a flicker of pride. Instead, he shuffled toward the next contract, clutching his sword like a guilty child clutching a candy bar, knowing that the only thing sharper than his blade was the realization that guilt never dulls. The cathedral's crypt smelled of damp stone and old incense, a stale perfume that clung to the air like a ghost's sigh. Flickering torchlight painted jittery shadows on the vaulted walls, turning each sarcophagus into a looming, stone-capped sentinel. Armand's boots splashed in shallow puddles of centuries-old rainwater, each step echoing like a drumbeat of impending doom. The Brotherhood's banner, scarlet as fresh blood, hung limp, a warning sign that this was no rehearsal, but the final act. He tightened his grip on the dagger, feeling the cold metal whisper, "Let's make this quick, or at least entertaining." From the darkness emerged the rival guild's leader, a hulking brute named Gervais, who looked like he'd stepped straight out of a medieval wrestling video game. Gervais sneered, brandishing a mace that drummed a menacing rhythm against the stone, while his henchmen circled like nervous cats. Armand's eyes flicked to the side, where a familiar silhouette, his trusted comrade Lucian, stood motionless, his hand trembling over a hidden blade. Suddenly, the air cracked with a betrayal's hiss. Lucian's dagger slipped from his grip and clanged against the floor, a metallic sigh that screamed, "I'm sorry, brother." The realization hit Armand like a catapult stone. Loyalty was a luxury they could no longer afford. The clash erupted in a chaotic ballet of steel, blood, and curses that would make a Shakespearean tragedy blush. Sparks flew as blades met, and the scent of copper mingled with the musty crypt odor, creating a perfume only assassins could love. In a split second, Lucian's head rolled off his shoulders, landing with a thud that sounded oddly like a bad joke's punchline. Armand stared at the lifeless eyes of his friend, feeling the weight of every shared secret crush like a sack of lead. The sound of Lucian's final gasp echoed off the stone, a grim reminder that even the best trained killers can't dodge fate's sharp edge. Sweat and blood slicked Armand's face as he faced Gervais, the remaining rival, whose grin was as wide as the cathedral's nave. The fight turned into a desperate dance, each strike a question, "What am I willing to lose?" When the last blow landed, Gervais fell, his armor clattering like a broken chime, and the crypt fell silent save for the distant toll of the cathedral's bells. Armand stood amid the carnage, the scarlet banner now dripping with the blood of both guilds, and understood that survival demanded the sacrifice of everything he once cherished: friendship, honor, even his own humanity. He felt the absurdity of it all, as if the universe had handed him a Game of Thrones finale without the drama credits, with the rival guild vanquished and the Brotherhood's future hanging by a thread. Armand slipped out of the crypt, the stone walls closing behind him like a tomb's cold embrace. The night air hit his face, sharp as a sword's edge, and he heard a distant lute playing a mournful tune, perhaps a troubadour mocking his loss. He knew the path ahead would be paved with more betrayals, more blood, and more absurdly heroic moments that would make future assassins cringe. Yet, in the flicker of torchlight, he caught a glimpse of his own reflection, a scarred silhouette that still wore a grin, because even a medieval assassin can appreciate a good punchline. And so, with a sigh that sounded suspiciously like a meme-filled sigh, he vanished into the city's shadows, ready to write the next chapter of his cursed legend. Armand staggers out of the crypt, the stench of iron and rotting cloth clinging to his nostrils like a bad perfume. The torchlight flickers across walls slick with blood, casting grotesque shadows that dance like medieval tick-tock dancers. He coughs, spitting clots of dark crimson, and the cold stone under his boots seems to whisper, "Welcome home, you filthy murderer." Yet his heart pounds with a wild, reckless rhythm, as if the very act of breathing outside those walls feels like a rebellion against death itself. He slams the heavy iron door shut, sealing away the world of silent blades and whispered contracts. Outside, the market square roars with merchants hawking moldy cheese and the sharp clang of blacksmiths forging more than just swords. They forge poverty, too. Armand discovers that freedom in medieval Europe is a thin sheet of parchment, easily torn by hunger, disease, and the ever-present stare of townsfolk who still see the scarlet mark of the Assassin's Guild on his forearms. His once proud cloak of secrecy now feels like a ragged coat, patched with the cheap linen of a beggar. The irony isn't lost on him. After a career spent slipping through shadows like a medieval version of a cyberpunk hacker, he now has to barter for a loaf of sour rye that tastes like old socks. He jokes to a grizzled tavern keeper that his new resume reads, "Former professional backstabber, now proficient in wiping mud off my shoes." The tavern's fire crackles, sending sparks onto the sticky floor, and the smell of smoked rabbit mingles with the lingering copper scent that refuses to leave his skin. Even the town's children point at him, whispering, "There's the guy who killed the mayor's cat. He's a real-life video game boss." Amid the ruckus, a quiet moment finds Armand perched on a rickety wooden bench, watching the river glide past, its surface slick with algae and the occasional glint of a fallen coin. The water's gentle murmur drowns out the distant clang of the forge, soothing the jagged edges of his past like a lullaby sung by a monk on a Tuesday. He realizes the worst part of being a medieval assassin, the constant dance with death, the endless guilt, the fear of being discovered, is finally tucked away in that blood-soaked crypt. For the first time in years, his mind isn't a tangled knot of contracts and poison recipes, but a simple, grateful sigh. With a ragged grin, Armand pulls a thin slice of bread from the vendor's stall, savoring its gritty texture as though it were a trophy. The crowd's chatter becomes background music to his newfound peace, a soundtrack he never imagined he'd enjoy after years of silence and shadow. He knows the road ahead is riddled with chores no assassin ever faced, sweeping his own hearth, mending torn clothes, and learning to smile without a dagger's glint in his eye. Yet, as the sun dips behind the castle's crenellated towers, painting the sky a bruised orange, Armand feels a warm ember of hope flickering inside, promising that even a former killer can rewrite his own legend. The wind howled through the ragged pines of Arden's borderlands, carrying the stench of burnt straw and rusted iron. Rurik, a lanky youth with a scar shaped like a lightning bolt across his cheek, trudged into the mud-splattered camp of the Crimson Company. Around him, campfires spat sparks that danced like fireflies trapped in a medieval rave, while the clank of armor echoed like a broken drum kit. He could hear distant trebuchet thuds, each one a reminder that peace was as rare as a unicorn in a tavern. Yet the promise of coin glimmered in his mind, brighter than any dragon's hoard, and he tightened his grip on the hilt of his battered longsword. That evening, Lord Calder, a rotund noble with a beard as tangled as a hedge maze, unfurled a parchment that smelled of ink and old sweat. He offered Rurik a contract, pay in gold, loyalty in blood, and a promise that the mercenary would die a hero, not a footnote. The inked words glistened like a cheat code for a video game, except the cheat was a blade and the boss was a battlefield. Rurik swore his sword upon the Lord's seal, feeling the cold metal bite his palm like a spiteful lover. The crowd of grizzled veterans snorted, some muttering that the only thing more binding than the oath was the Lord's penchant for late night feasts. The next dawn, Rurik learned that pay meant a sack of copper that clanged like a broken tambourine when tossed into his hands. Loyalty, however, was measured in the number of enemy heads he could stack on a cart, until it resembled a grotesque tower of pancakes. In the heat of battle, the scent of sweat, blood, and roasted boar mingled, and arrows whistled past like angry tweets. He discovered that betrayal was a silent partner, lurking behind every campfire's flicker, ready to turn a comrade's shield into a paper plate. One night, A fellow mercenary tried to swap Rurik's sword for a rusted kitchen knife, claiming the blade was vintage. And the joke fell flatter than a pancake in a rainstorm. The betrayal came to a head when Lord Calder demanded Rurik lead a charge against a hill fortified with nothing but a few angry goats and a rusted catapult. As the mercenaries surged forward, the goats bleated a chorus that sounded suspiciously like a choir of off-key singers, while the catapult sputtered and spat out a single, sad stone that hit a nearby tavern sign. Suddenly, Calder's men vanished, leaving Rurik and his battered squad to wonder if the Lord had simply ghosted them like a bad Tinder date. In the chaos, Rurik caught a glimpse of Calder slipping away with a sack of gold, his cape fluttering like a superhero's. Except the hero was definitely not saving the day. The irony wasn't lost on Rurik. He'd signed up for blood, not a slapstick comedy. And the only thing he could trust was the bitter taste of his own spit on the battlefield. When the dust settled, Rurik stood amid the carnage, the ground slick with mud, blood, and the occasional stray ale bottle that glimmered like a misplaced treasure. He counted his coins, each clink a reminder that even a mercenary's wallet can be as empty as a dragon's lair after a tax audit. Yet the contract's ink still stained his hands, a permanent reminder that in the medieval world, paperwork could be deadlier than any sword. With a wry grin, he muttered that blood and contracts sounded like a terrible romance novel, but at least it kept the tavern keepers busy with gossip. As he rode away on a squeaky, overburdened horse, the borderlands whispered that the next contract would be signed with a smile, a sword, and perhaps a meme about "I'm not a hero. I'm just here for the loot." The cold bite of dawn scraped across the ragged backs of Rurik's men as they trudged through a landscape that smelled of mildew and ash. Every village they passed was a ghost of its former self, roof thatch gone, fields turned to cracked, brown parchment. The wind carried the distant whine of a church bell, but the sound was muffled by the groaning of empty bellows in abandoned smithies. Even the crows seemed too gaunt, their black feathers slick with a film of dust that clung like a bad beard. Rurik raised his hand, shivering not from fear, but from the sheer, relentless hunger that marched alongside them. Hunger in those days was less a polite craving and more a gnawing, ever-present predator that made every step feel like dragging a sack of stones. The soldiers' stomachs growled louder than a tavern brawl, and the stale scent of sour porridge lingered in the air like a bad joke nobody wanted to repeat. Some men tried to subsist on wild nettles, which tasted like the inside of a boot after a week in the mud. One lanky recruit whispered that the only thing thinner than their rations was the plot of a sitcom about knights who never fought. and the whole band cracked a grin despite the ache. Ironically, the only thing they could afford to loot was a half-eaten loaf that had been abandoned in a barn. Crust so hard it could double as a shield, disease stalked the march like a sneaky rogue in a tavern corner, waiting for a chance to stab you with a cough. A cough so wet it sounded like a tavern door slammed shut, and the men's faces grew as pale as the moon on a winter night. One of the veterans swore the pestilence smelled like rotting fish left out in the sun for 3 weeks, sweet, sour, and utterly unforgiving. The medic, a grizzled old woman named Helga, slapped a poultice on a boy's forehead while muttering that the pestilence was the real boss battle. No cheat codes. By night, the campfire's glow did little to hide the shivering silhouettes of men whose eyes flickered between fear and a desperate, iron-clad resolve. When hunger and disease threatened to turn the men into wailing ghosts, Rurik faced the ugly truth of mercenary life. Looting became a cruel compromise. He ordered a raid on a widow's cottage, the scent of stale bread and dried herbs greeting them like a bitter perfume. The widow, eyes hollowed out like parchment, offered nothing but a cracked mug and a whispered, "Take what you must, lest the Lord take you whole." The irony was thick enough to slice with a sword these men, who once prided themselves on honor, now stole from those already starved, feeling like characters in a grim RPG where the loot table only contained misery. A half smile crept across Rurik's face as he muttered, "Winter is coming," and were the night's delivery service. By the time the band limped to the next ruined hamlet, the march of hunger had carved scars deeper than any blade. The air was heavy with the stench of sweat, blood, and the faint, lingering perfume of death, like a medieval version of a bad perfume commercial. Rurik stared at the horizon, where a lone rooster crowed like a busted alarm clock, reminding everyone that sunrise was inevitable. No matter how ragged the crew felt, he swallowed, feeling a lump in his throat that was part regret, part resolve, and whispered, "May the force be with us," because the gods seemed to have taken a day off. The men, battered but still standing, let out a low, guttural laugh that echoed across the ruined fields, a strange anthem of survival in a world that had turned kindness into a luxury they could no longer afford. The first stones of Blackstone keep siege struck like a bad Tinder swipe, unwanted and relentless. Our ragtag band of mercenaries, hired for the promise of gold, found themselves sandwiched between a towering curtain of iron and an enemy artillery that sounded like a dragon on a bad caffeine binge. Morning broke with the stench of damp stone and the acrid perfume of black powder, making even the hardest veterans' nostrils curl in protest. We huddled behind a wall scarred with centuries of battle, listening to the clamor of trebuchets that rattled our teeth like a busted drum kit. In that moment, the only thing louder than the thunderous booms was the collective mutter that maybe, just maybe, we'd end up as another footnote in a bard's lament. Each day, the enemy unleashed a volley of iron-shod stones that pounded the keep's outer ramparts with the enthusiasm of a toddler at a piñata. The ground shivered, dust rose like a funeral veil, and the clang of metal on stone turned the air into a chaotic percussion orchestra. Our own cannons, patched together from salvaged barrel staves and a questionable amount of prayer, coughed out sputtering blasts that smelled faintly of burnt cheese and desperation. When a stray bolt ricocheted into the mess hall, it sent a cascade of boiled cabbage spilling like green confetti onto the muddy floor. Even the rats seemed to pause, their squeaks muttering something akin to, "Do we get a cut of the loot, or just the leftovers?" Supplies dwindled faster than a binge watcher's stamina during a marathon of medieval dramas. Our rations boiled down to hardtack that cracked like old gossip, and a watery stew that could double as a face mask for the weary. The smell of rot seeped from the storeroom, a perfume of sour milk and forgotten hopes that made the guards' eyes water more than the siege rain. We traded a few bits of silver for a sack of roasted boar, only to discover the meat was as tough as a knight's oath and as greasy as a wizard's spellbook after a potion spill. By the third week, even the most seasoned swordsman confessed his stomach growled louder than the trebuchet, prompting us to consider a side quest to the enemy's kitchen. Loss came in waves, each comrade falling like a badly timed meme that nobody wanted to scroll past. When Joran, the axe hand, slipped on a slick of blood and mud, his scream cut through the clamor, a raw note of terror that still echoes in my dreams. The sight of blood staining the stones made the air taste metallic, a reminder that death here wasn't just a distant concept, but a daily, messy reality. We whispered prayers to gods who seemed to be on a coffee break, while the enemy's cheers rose like a twisted soundtrack to a poorly edited battle scene. Yet, amid the chaos, the men clung to each other, swapping jokes about the absurdity of fighting for a pouch of gold that might as well be a plastic token from a medieval arcade. When the siege finally dragged into its fourth month, we realized our resolve was as stubborn as a mule wearing iron shoes. Brotherhood, forged in the crucible of endless cannon fire, became a bond tighter than the laces on a knight's armor, even when the only loot left was a dented helmet and a sigh. We started chanting a ragged version of Eye of the Tiger, because if you can't have a proper marching song, you might as well improvise with a 90s pop hit turned medieval. In the end, the keep didn't fall. The enemy's siege engines sputtered out like a dying dragon's cough, and we emerged blood-smeared, hungry, but still standing proof that mercenaries can outlast even the most melodramatic Netflix war series. So raise a mug of sour ale to the men of Blackstone Keep, whose grit turned a hopeless siege into a legend that even the bards will reluctantly admit was more gritty than their finest ballad. Rurik stood on the battered parapet, the air thick with the iron tang of blood and the acrid bite of burning pitch. Below, clang of steel rang like a dozen angry blacksmiths, while the screams of wounded men rose in a chorus no minstrel would dare set to lute. The keep's stone walls trembled as catapults hurled flaming rocks that hissed against the sky, painting it a sickly orange. Sweat slicked his leather gauntlet, and his own heartbeat hammered louder than the war drums. He could taste the metallic grit of fear on his tongue, but his grip on his axe remained as steady as a monk's prayer. Just as the tide of battle seemed to crest, a breathless courier slipped through the chaos, thrusting a crumpled parchment into Rurik's calloused hand. The ink, smeared by rain and blood, revealed the Lord's deceit, a mountain of gold owed to the mercenaries, still unpaid, and a secret order to abandon them at sunrise. Rurik's eyes narrowed, the irony cutting sharper than his sword. His employer had hired them to die, then tried to skimp on the bill like a miser at a tavern. The smell of damp parchment mingled with the stench of rotting flesh, a reminder that contracts were as fragile as a spider's web in a storm. He laughed, a short, bitter bark, thinking even Loki would find this plot undercooked. With the sun beginning to bleed orange over the horizon, Rurik barked a command that cut through the clamor like a war horn. He rallied the bruised mercenaries, their armor dented, faces smeared with mud and gore, and urged them to hold the keep as if it were the last piece of pizza at a party. The enemy surged like a tide of wolves, their arrows whistling, and the ground squelched beneath the mire of broken spears and spilled ale. Rurik's blade sang as it cleaved through armor, each swing releasing a spray of hot blood that smelled like iron and burnt canvas. The mercenaries fought with a ferocity born of betrayal, their shouted curses echoing off the stone, turning desperation into a grim dance. Just as the fighting reached a fever pitch, a stray arrow nicked Rurik's cheek, delivering a sting that felt oddly like a slap from a sitcom dad. He wiped the blood with the back of his gauntleted hand, muttering, "You can't make this stuff up, can you?" The keep's gate, creaking under the weight of siege, seemed to sigh in resignation, as if quoting Gandalf, "All we have to decide is what to do with the time that the battle gives us." Yet, even as the walls shuddered, a sudden burst of laughter erupted from a nearby dwarf who shouted, "If we survive, I'm demanding a souvenir, maybe a dragon egg for the war chest." The absurdity of the moment clashed with the grim reality, making the battlefield feel like a mashup of medieval drama and a modern video game glitch. When the first light of dawn finally pierced the smoke, the enemy retreated, leaving behind a field strewn with broken shields, half-eaten corpses, and the lingering scent of charred bread. Rurik, chest heaving, surveyed the battered keep that still stood, its battered banners fluttering like tired flags after a concert. The Lord's promise of payment dissolved into the wind, but the mercenaries earned something far richer, a legend that would be whispered in taverns for generations. With a wry grin, Rurik tipped his weathered helm to the sunrise, proclaiming, "We may not have gotten paid, but we sure earned a sequel." The keep's fate was sealed not by gold, but by the unbreakable resolve of those who chose to fight when the odds were as stacked as a Jenga tower on a shaking ship. The keep collapsed in a chorus of cracking timber and splintered stone, and the air reeked of burnt pitch and coppery blood. Rurik crouched amid the rubble. His armor clanged like a rusty wind chime as he pulled himself free. Ash fell like ash-gray snow, coating his face and the broken banners that once shouted the clan's name. A lone crow perched on a shattered tower, cawing a funeral dirge that made even the wind wince. He stared at the charred courtyard, where the only thing still standing was a lone, scorched wheat stalk swaying defiantly. Mercenary glory had always tasted like stale ale, cheap, fleeting, and leaving a bitter afterbite. He remembered the clang of swords against shields, the roar of crowds, and the way commanders tossed gold like confetti at a medieval rave. Yet every triumph had been a rehearsal for death. The cheers faded as quickly as the smoke, and his comrades vanished like mirages in a heat-soaked desert. The irony was as sharp as his blade. He fought for profit, while the innocent paid with their lives. A twisted plot any Netflix binge watcher would call the good soldier Svedj meets Game of Thrones. In the silence of the ruins, Rurik felt the hollow echo of his own battle cries reverberate against stone, mocking his past ambition. He knelt on the cold stones, the weight of his sword suddenly feeling like a leaden promise he no longer wanted to keep. With a grim smile, he swore an oath louder than any war chant, promising to shield the meek even if it meant swapping steel for soil. The oath tasted of iron and fresh earth, a strange blend that made his breath sting like cold rain on a battlefield. He pictured himself planting seed instead of planting the stakes of a siege, and the thought sparked a flicker of hope brighter than any pyre. The ruin echoed his vow, and even the crows seemed to hush, as if the world itself was waiting for his next, unexpected move. At dawn, Rurik trudged to the village field, where a rusted plow lay abandoned like a forgotten sword in a stone. He dragged the heavy wood and iron implement through the mud, feeling each splinter of earth bite his boots the way a dagger would a noble's throat. The sun rose, painting the sky a bruised orange that reminded him of the battlefield sunsets he used to chase. Only this time the horizon smelled of fresh thyme instead of gunpowder. As he furrowed the soil, a nearby goat bleated a tune that sounded suspiciously like the theme from The Mandalorian, making him grin at the absurdity of a warrior turned farmer, humming a space western anthem. By noon, a modest row of sprouts peeked through the dark loam, proof that even a blood-soaked heart could nurture new life. The villagers gathered, eyes wide as they watched the former blade-bearer now coaxing wheat from the earth, whispering that perhaps the gods had finally upgraded his character sheet. Children chased dust devils while Rurik laughed, the sound ringing clearer than any battle cry he ever let out. He knew the road ahead would be strewn with hardships, famine, raiders, and the occasional bureaucratic tax collector who smelled of ink and fear. But he felt ready to meet them with a hoe instead of a hammer. In the evenings, he would sit by the hearth, swapping tales of sword play for stories of sewing, and the fire would crackle like applause for his new act. And if fate ever called him back to the front, he promised himself he'd answer with a farmer's stubborn stubbornness, a plow as his shield, and maybe, just maybe, a wink to the distant audience that life, even in ash, can rewrite its script. Ravenshallow swarmed like a beehive in midsummer, its cobblestones slick with spilled ale and the sharp tang of smoked fish. Merchants shouted over the clatter of wagon wheels, while children darted between stalls, their laughter muffled by the distant toll of the town bell. Amid the chaos, a discreet wooden sign, painted with a serpent coiled around a thistle, marked the unassuming doorway of the Poisoners' Guild. Inside, Master Alaric lounged on a chair of reclaimed oak, his silvered beard glinting like moonlit venom, and his smile hinted at secrets darker than the night market. Even the rats seemed to whisper his name, as if he were the unofficial mayor of mischief. The guild offered its lethal services with the smooth charm of a troubadour selling love songs, except the verses ended in a silent sigh. Nobles slipped sealed vials into silk purses, hoping a rival would taste a drop of midnight rose flavored with cyanide, while merchants begged for a discreet drop to silence a cheating accountant. Alaric delivered his poisons in crystal flasks that sang when shaken, the sound like glass teeth clicking together. He joked that his concoctions were more reliable than a royal decree, a grin that made the candlelight dance on the walls. The town's gossip spread faster than a plague, ironically, the very thing the guild could cure or end with a single sip. Myra, the guild's newest apprentice, scrubbed copper pots until her fingertips tingled with the metallic bite of iron filings. She moved like a shy shadow, her hair tucked under a soot-stained cap, eyes flickering between the glitter of amber poisons and the grimy ledger that lay forgotten beneath a barrel of fermented onions. One evening, the pungent odor of garlic and rot guided her hand to a leather-bound book whose pages smelled of old blood and dried rosemary. As she turned the brittle sheets, a hidden ledger slipped out, its ink still fresh, inked in a hurried script that rattled like a nervous horse. The ledger's margins were scrawled with names, dates, and a chilling phrase. Phase 2, the crown's harvest, sending a shiver up Myra's spine that had nothing to do with the cold stone floor. The entries spoke of a plan to lace the council's banquet wine with a slow-acting toxin that would make the nobles see their own reflections as wraiths, an elegant revenge for centuries of oppression. Alaric's charismatic smile now seemed to hide a razor-sharp edge, as if he were rehearsing a line from a Shakespeare tragedy while sipping his own brew. Myra's heart hammered louder than the market drums, and she swore she heard the distant chant of a nursery rhyme about poisoned apples echoing through the rafters. The irony was almost theatrical. The very guild that protected the town's secrets was plotting to poison its protectors. She imagined herself as a medieval version of a superhero, minus the cape, trying to decide whether to expose the plot or stay loyal to the only family she'd ever known. Now the air in Ravenshallow felt thicker, as if the town itself were holding its breath, waiting for a decision that could tip the balance between honor and annihilation. Myra tucked the ledger into the seam of her apron, her palms slick with sweat and the lingering scent of arsenic. She glanced at Alaric, whose eyes glittered like polished obsidian, and wondered if the weight of her conscience could shatter the delicate glass of his influence. With a nervous chuckle, she muttered under her breath, "May the Force be with me," because even in the Middle Ages, a little pop culture humor could cut through the gloom. The stage was set for a clash that would echo through Ravenshallow's alleys long after the last candle guttered. And Myra stood at the crossroads, a modest apprentice poised to become the town's unexpected heroine. Myra felt the weight of a fresh parchment slide into her palm, the seal of Lord Harwick dripping with the scent of stale ale and ambition. The Lord's request was simple. A rival baron's life should end with a whisper of lavender-scented death. Myra's eyes flickered to the vial of nightshade she cradled, the dark liquid swirling like a mini storm in glass. She could almost hear the rival's hearty laugh turning to a silent cough, an irony not lost on her. Her craft was poetry, not a punchline. Yet the coin glittered, and the promise of a scarlet cloak for her guild made the moral knot tighten like a rope around her throat. In the cramped cellar beneath the guild hall, Myra mixed the poison with a surgeon's precision, the air thick with the coppery tang of blood and the sweet decay of rotting herbs. The apprentices whispered jokes about killing it on stage, but Myra's hands trembled as she added a drop of belladonna, recalling the faces of innocent townsfolk she had once saved from a plague. Every stir sang a dirge for the lives she would soon erase, each bubble a tiny rebellion against her own conscience. She tasted bitterness on her tongue, half from the herbs, half from the knowledge that her art could be wielded for power, not protection. Still, the guild's ledger swelled, and the Lord's smile in the contract was as crooked as a thief's grin. Word of the contract slipped like a rogue wind through the cobblestones, reaching the ears of the Crimson Dagger Guild, rivals who prided themselves on selling nothing but fireworks and fortune. Their leader, a wiry man named Bragg, sent a messenger with a scented flower that read, "We hear you're playing with the dead, need a hand." Meanwhile, Father Aldrich, the Inquisitor with a habit as black as his heart, marched into the marketplace, his voice booming like a church bell, and his nostrils flaring at the faint perfume of poison wafting from a nearby stall. He declared, "No more shadows. Let the light of the holy see every venomous contract." The city buzzed, and Myra sensed the walls of secrecy closing in, as if the town itself were tightening a corset around the guild. The guild's safe house, once a sanctuary of clinking glass and quiet mutters, now throbbed with frantic footfalls and the metallic clang of swords being drawn. Myra watched as scouts scuffled with rival guilds in alleys slick with rain and blood, the sound of splintering wood echoing like a grim percussion. The Inquisitor's men, clad in dark robes, stalked the streets, their lanterns casting ghostly halos that turned every shadow into a potential assassin. Myra's heart hammered against her ribs, each beat a reminder that the craft she loved was now a powder keg ready to explode. She tightened her grip on the vial, knowing that any misstep could turn her into a martyr for a cause she never intended to champion. When the night finally fell, Myra slipped through the city like a cat burglar, the moon a pale witness to the hiss of poison seeping into a goblet. The rival baron raised his cup, his laughter booming, only to choke on the sweet, deadly perfume that tasted like wilted roses. As his eyes widened in terror, Myra felt a pang of irony so sharp it could have sliced the very rope binding her to the guild. The crowd erupted, not in applause, but in a cacophony of gasps and frantic whispers, while the Inquisitor's torch flickered in the distance, ready to ignite the next scandal. Myra retreated into the shadows, the contract fulfilled, but the price was a lingering taste of ash, a reminder that even the most silent contracts echo loudly in the corridors of conscience. Alaric paced the dim backroom of the Guildhall, the smell of rusted iron and stale ale clinging to his coat. He had learned that secrets in a poisoner's guild die faster than a dead mouse. So he summoned a ragtag band of mercenaries known for their blunt swords and even blunter morals. The mercenaries arrived, boots splashing in the oily puddles. Their leader, a scarred dwarf named Goric, who claimed to have once saved a princess from a dragon, though the only fire he ever saw was the forge. Alaric offered them a sack of powdered nightshade and a promise of gold enough to buy a lifetime supply of fine cheese, hoping fear would bind them tighter than any oath. The pact felt as bitter as wormwood, a handshake that tasted of danger and desperation. Myra slipped through the cloistered arches, the scent of incense battling the underlying rot of the guild's poison vats. She slipped a sealed parchment into the pocket of Father Lucian, the inquisitor whose eyebrows were so sharply arched they could pierce through lies. Her note whispered of black tar in the well, of Alaric's trade secrets, and begged the church to intervene before the whole town turned into a giant souffle of bile. Myra's heart pounded like a drum in a battlefield tavern, each thump echoing the hiss of boiling cauldrons in the guild's hidden chambers. She left the chapel with a nervous grin, thinking that maybe, just maybe, the Inquisition would finally get a taste of the toxic drama that had been brewing. By twilight, the mercenaries and the Inquisitor's men collided in the narrow alleys, swords clanging against the sound of gulls screaming over the river. Goric shouted, "Traitor!" as he realized the sack of nightshade had been swapped for a sack of flour, a mocking gesture as bland as a monk's sermon. Alaric's eyes flashed like a struck candle, and he lunged, his dagger dripping with a faint violet hue that smelled faintly of dead lilacs. Meanwhile, Father Lucian, clutching his rosary tighter than a cat clings to a mouse, discovered Myra's secret letter tucked inside his own vest. Realizing she'd been playing both sides like a minstrel with a lute, the air turned sour with betrayal, the scent of copper and sweat mixing with the lingering odor of poison, as each faction wondered who'd be the next to swallow the bitterness. Before the sun rose, someone, no one could tell if it was the mercenaries or the inquisitors, tipped a vial of blackened liquid into the town's central well, the water turning a sickly green as if a troll had dyed it. Children's laughter turned to whimpering cries when the first sip erupted like a mouthful of sour grapes, their faces contorting in grotesque surprise. The market stalls erupted in a cacophony of shouts, clanking pots, and the bitter hiss of boiling broth as vendors tried desperately to cleanse their wares. Rumors spread faster than a plague, each whispered accusation, dripping with the same acrid stench that now clung to every cobblestone. The townsfolk, eyes wide as saucers, began to suspect even the town crier, whose booming voice now sounded like a villainous narrator in a low-budget horror film. In the aftermath, Alaric stood on the ruined well's edge, his cloak soaked with the very poison he sought to protect, and muttered, "Well, that's one way to flush out the competition." Myra, bruised but defiant, watched the Inquisitor seal the well with holy chalk, the chalk crackling like popcorn under a fire, while she plotted her next move from the shadows of the tavern. The mercenaries, now sullen as soggy bread, trudged away, their gold pockets heavy with the bitter taste of half-won victories and half-lost lives. The town, its streets slick with the lingering scent of rot and fresh rain, whispered a new proverb: trust the poisoner, but never trust the one who sells you the antidote. And so the bitter alliances lingered, a reminder that in the Middle Ages, even a drop of venom could rewrite the entire saga, like a medieval version of Game of Thrones, only with more rats and fewer dragons. The moon hung like a tarnished coin over the cobblestones as the mercenaries slipped into the Guildhall's shadowed backroom. Candlelight flickered, casting skeletal silhouettes on the stone walls where whispered oaths once echoed. Suddenly, swords unsheathed with a clatter that sounded like a tavern's broken mug, and the hired blades turned their backs on the guildmaster. Alaric's scarred hand hovered over a vial that smelled of rotten almonds and burnt incense. The air grew thick with the iron tang of betrayal, and the night seemed to hold its breath. From the town's towering spire, the Inquisitor's men stormed down the narrow alleys, their armor clanking like a marching band of angry tin cans. Torches sputtered, sending ribbons of orange smoke curling through the narrow streets, while the distant howl of a dog added a soundtrack of dread. They battered the heavy oak doors of the Guildhall, each thud reverberating like a drumbeat in a heavy metal concert. Inside, the mercenaries shouted orders, their voices snarling over the clang of steel and the squeal of rats scattering. The Inquisitor, a gaunt figure with a cross-etched visor, raised his sword and declared, "By Saint Michael, this poison den is over." Alaric seized the moment, flinging the cursed vial onto the stone floor, where it shattered with a shivering hiss. A violet cloud unfurled, seeping into cracks, licking the air with the scent of dead lilies and sour milk. Men clutched their throats, eyes bulging like cartoon characters, while the Inquisitor's men stumbled, their faces turning a ghastly shade of green. The toxin slithered like a living thing, crawling under boots and into the cracks of the ancient foundation, turning the hall into a poisoned greenhouse. Somewhere above, a stray cat yowled, as if blaming the gods for the foul chemistry experiment gone wrong. Myra stood at the edge of the chaos, her mind a flickering lantern of alchemical knowledge and moral dilemma. She could recite the antidote's formula faster than a bard could strum a lute, but each word would cost the town its fearsome guild of poisoners, an institution that kept the neighboring lords' armies at bay. Do I play hero or villain? She muttered, half laughing at the absurdity of choosing between a plague and a power vacuum, like picking between a dragon and a bureaucrat. The scent of the toxin pressed against her senses, a reminder that any hesitation would turn her skin to parchment. With a wry grin, she lifted the tiny silver vial, feeling the weight of destiny as heavy as a sack of fresh roasted pheasant. In a breathless motion, Myra tipped the antidote into the swirling poison, watching the two clouds clash like rival Hogwarts houses in a duel. The violet haze sputtered, then dissolved into a sickly amber, and the wounded combatants gasped as the toxic grip loosened. The Inquisitor lowered his sword, eyes widening in disbelief as the hall filled with a strange, sweet perfume reminiscent of honey-glazed pastries, an irony not lost on anyone who'd ever tasted a victory too early. The mercenaries, now free from the toxin's chokehold, lowered their weapons, their faces a mixture of relief and bewildered admiration for Myra's quick wit. As dawn cracked, the town awoke to rumors of a crimson coup that sounded more like a twisted episode of a medieval reality show, and the guild, though scarred, survived, its dark legacy now tempered by a hint of unexpected mercy. The last ember of the guild's hearth sputtered out, and a thin veil of gray ash drifted over the broken stonework like an ancient snow globe shaken by fate. Cobblers and bakers alike paused, their noses twitching at the lingering scent of burnt copper and bitter herbs that clung to the air. Lanterns flickered, casting skeletal shadows that danced across the shattered apothecary sign, now splintered into a dozen mournful splinters. Even the rats seemed to hush, as if waiting for a verdict from the very walls that had once whispered secret recipes. In that moment, the city exhaled a shaky sigh, for the poison peddling guild had finally been unmade. The town's engineers, armed with wooden buckets and a stubborn optimism that could rival a wizard's apprentice, set about cleansing the river that had run black as midnight ink. They scooped up the vile liquid, each splash echoing like a slap to the conscience of the waterfolk, and dumped it onto the stones where it frothed into a grotesque foam of dead lilies. The smell of rotten fennel gave way to the crisp, clean bite of spring rain, and children who had once dared not touch the water now squealed as they splashed, their laughter ricocheting off the newly washed banks. By sunset, the river sang a gentle hymn, its surface shimmering like a polished shield, proof that even the most toxic of brews can be washed away, if only someone has the guts to roll up their sleeves. The whole affair felt like a medieval episode of DIY disaster, only with fewer explosions and more moral cleanup. Myra stepped onto the council's stone dais, her cloak trailing ash-stained threads that whispered against the marble like a guilty secret. The scar across her left cheek, a souvenir from a rogue vial that burst like a pop culture exploding soda. At a teen's birthday, had faded to a pale pink, but her eyes still burned with a sharp, amber fire. She spoke in a voice that cracked like a potion bottle under pressure, recounting the night the guild's mastermind tried to perfume the town with mortal death. With each word, the counselors shifted, some wiping sweat from their brows, others glancing at the soot-caked bricks as if they might sprout new sins. The room hummed with a mixture of horror, admiration, and a pinch of bewildered curiosity. Myra had turned from poisoner to the very antidote they needed. When the ink dried on the new alchemical charter, it read like a medieval terms of service, with clauses that would make even the most seasoned sorcerer raise an eyebrow. No more secret societies, cloaked in candlelight. Every apprentice now had to register their recipes, label every vial with a warning sticker that read, "Do not drink unless you're a dragon." The council mandated weekly smell tests, where the town's official sniffers, armed with noses as keen as bloodhounds, would parade through market stalls, waving scented ribbons like medieval paparazzi. Myra, now honorary overseer, chuckled softly as she watched a bumbling apprentice try to hide a vial of lavender-kissed arsenic behind a basket of oranges, only to have it exposed by a stray cat sneezing in protest. The regulations, though strict, smelled faintly of fresh rosemary, a reminder that order can be fragrant if you dare to season it right. As twilight settled, the city's bells tolled a mournful cadence, their echo rolling over rooftops, still smudged with the remnants of ash. Myra lingered at the edge of the square, feeling the cool cobblestones under her boots and the weight of a world that had witnessed both the brilliance and the betrayal of its own artisans. She glanced at the river, now a mirror of starlight, and thought of how power can corrupt even the most skilled hands, just as a noble knight can be tempted by a shiny new sword. The night air carried a faint, lingering perfume of burnt herbs, a bittersweet reminder that some scars never truly fade. In that stillness, the city whispered its lesson. Even when the dark side is vanquished, the ember of ambition forever smolders, waiting for the next careless breath.